There are two things that are important in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember what the second one is. This is a quote from US presidential candidate William McKinley's chief fundraiser Mark Hanna during his 1896 presidential campaign. Needless to say, William McKinley went on to win the presidency. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the influence of money and oligarchs in US democracy. Oligarchy is a system where political and economic power becomes concentrated in the hands of a small elite group, which means a select few individuals or families with immense wealth or long-standing influence wield disproportionate control over a nation's governance and resources. And this leads to policies that primarily benefit this group, widening the economic disparity across the populace. So when did money and economic influence make an appearance in US democracy? It was around the election of 1828 when the Democrat Andrew Jackson was up against the Republican and the incumbent John Quincy Adams. By 1828, with the expanding population and additional states joining the Union, a lot more resources were needed to reach out to the voters. So Andrew Jackson's staff maintained 2 campaign offices, while his group of powerful political friends distributed pro-Jackson pamphlets. Jackson himself did not seek any financial support, but he did start the practice of rewarding political loyalists with federal positions. But during his presidency in 1832, Andrew Jackson vetoed the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States on the basis that the bank was unauthorized by the Constitution, was subversive to the rights of the states, and dangerous to the liberties of the people. And this thought process existed because the banks controlled the credit and the loans. In response, the Second Bank of the United States spent big money to bring other politicians to its side and prevent Andrew Jackson from getting re-elected. But Andrew Jackson did get re-elected, and he highlighted the adverse impact of big corporations in a statement which said, "Whether the people of the United States are to govern, or whether the power and money of a great corporation are to be secretly exerted to influence their judgment and control their decisions." Abraham Lincoln was able to build the fledgling Republican Party into a powerhouse by offering jobs and military contracts to northern businesses in exchange for contributions. But a few decades later, as the United States moved into the Gilded Age, businesses started seeing campaign contributions to both parties as a standard cost of doing business. The Gilded Age was the period from the end of the Civil War to the dawn of the 20th century, when America saw a huge surge in capitalism. It was the era of railroads, telegraphs, booming cities, and bustling factories. And by some strange coincidence, 4 businessmen were at the forefront of influencing politics. And these were John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and Cornelius Vanderbilt. And the political influence of these 4 businessmen became amply clear during the election of 1896. The election in which Republican William McKinley was pitted against the Democrat William Jennings Bryan. The primary objective of oligarchs when it comes to exercising political influence is to ensure that their money stays safe. And this can mean several things, like ensuring that the taxes on their wealth are low, the governmental policies are not going to be negatively impactful to their wealth, and they have ample opportunities to expand and grow their wealth. Now, one of the key issues during that time that businesses were facing was labor unrest. And these four oligarchs, that is, Rockefeller, Carnegie, JP Morgan, and Vanderbilt, contributed to William McKinley's campaign close to an equivalent of about $40 million today. And in return, the Republicans, who were at that time the party of the common man, decided to side with the businesses when it came to resolving labor unrest problems. Mark Hanna, the chief campaign manager of William McKinley, influenced the Republican stance on labor unrest by asking workers not to organize for any other purpose than mutual benefit to the employer and the employee. There was, however, a bigger reason that the big businesses were favoring William McKinley for presidency in 1896. In 1890, William McKinley had introduced and managed the passage of the McKinley Tariff Act to protect American industries while he was a representative from Ohio in Congress. The act raised taxes on most imported goods from 38% to 49.5%, and at the same time eliminated the tax on luxury items such as coffee, tea, sugar, hides, and molasses. William McKinley went on to win the presidency, but the public had become aware of the immense power of big businesses by this time. William McKinley went on to win a second term, but was assassinated in 1901, and his VP, Teddy Roosevelt, became the new president. The economic environment creates oligarchs when businesses are allowed to become so huge that they have enough economic muscle to influence government policy. And the only way to address this is to prevent these businesses from becoming economic powerhouses. And that is exactly what Teddy Roosevelt had in mind when he took over as president. In his first annual message to Congress on December 3rd, 1901, Teddy Roosevelt began to articulate a new anti-monopoly doctrine that would define his presidency. He stated that great corporations exist only because they are created and safeguarded by our institutions, and is therefore our right and duty to see that they work in harmony with these institutions. He went on to assert that the federal government needed to assume power of supervision and regulation over all corporations doing interstate business. Now, as I mentioned earlier, post the Civil War, the US economy had grown on a massive scale. But during this growth, a lot of the industries like oil, steel, sugar, tobacco, whiskey had undergone massive consolidation, which had led to monopolistic arrangements wherein businesses operated in a multitude of states controlled by a single entity. And this is exactly what Teddy Roosevelt was trying to dismantle. Along with the McKinley Tariff Act, Congress had also passed the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which was a federal statute which prohibited activities that restricted interstate commerce and competition in the marketplace. This act, though, had mostly been dormant since its passage, thanks to the influence of the big businesses. The Teddy Roosevelt administration got busy and sued to dismantle national securities under the Sherman Antitrust Act. The case eventually went to the Supreme Court, and in March of 1904, the Supreme Court sided with the administration in a 5-4 decision. This was just the start, and Roosevelt went on to use the Sherman Act to dismantle dozens of other monopolies, including John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil monopoly. And all of a sudden, a lot of the monopolies started going through a series of inquiries and investigations. And each of these investigations revealed something new, but also a pattern that a relatively small group of business tycoons were reigning over vital swaths of the economy. And this was evident in 1907 when a financial panic began on Wall Street and sent the nation into a tailspin. One single oligarch, JP Morgan, played the role of central banker when the nation still lacked a central bank. JP Morgan was able to single-handedly use his financial muscle to rescue the ailing banks and pull the financial system out of this crisis. So, along with the dismantling of these big monopolies, President Teddy Roosevelt also called for a ban on all financial contributions towards political campaigns. The Tillman Act was introduced in Congress and signed into law by President Teddy Roosevelt on January 26, 1907. The Tillman Act explicitly prohibited corporations and national banks from contributing money to federal campaigns. By 1914, Congress had passed the Clayton Antitrust Act, which made the Sherman Act more powerful, and created the Federal Trade Commission, or FTC, to crack down on monopolistic practices. Later that year, under the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, the Federal Reserve was inaugurated, and it comprised a series of regional reserve banks to prevent any monopolistic control over a single central bank. This ushered in a new era of banking and finally brought Wall Street into partnership with the government. Looking back, Teddy Roosevelt is often credited with pulling the United States from the brink of oligarchy back into democracy during the Gilded Era. So, with the tight scrutiny around campaign contributions, oligarchy was fairly contained during the early part of the 20th century, though political corruption with scandals like the Teapot Dome scandal continued to exist. And as the United States and the rest of the world entered the Great Depression, Wall Street was squarely blamed for this financial crisis. And as FDR assumed office with the promise of taking the country out of this Great Depression via the New Deal, Wall Street became extremely concerned about losing power as the new regulatory environment started taking shape. And in 1933, some big names on Wall Street got together to orchestrate a coup to overthrow FDR. The coup never materialized, and in exchange for clemency for trying to orchestrate a coup, FDR got these Wall Street barons to agree to his New Deal. For those of you interested, I've talked about this coup in more detail in episode 76, Financial Coups, Haiti, FDR, and Guatemala. As the United States started emerging out of the Great Depression, a major milestone related to political campaign finance was the birth of the Political Action Committee, or the PAC. The PAC came about to circumvent the restrictions placed on corporations and individuals towards contributing to presidential campaigns. PACs solicit smaller contributions from a much larger number of individuals to overcome the individual limits on contributions, and in the end, they're able to provide substantial funds to candidates. And the first PAC was created in 1944 by the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which sought to raise funds to assist the re-election of President FDR. So with the PACs in place, it was only a matter of time when the oligarchs would once again be able to push forth their agenda. So what are the key elements of the agenda of the oligarchs? Not too much. Just minimal taxation, reduced regulation of their industry, and minimal impediments in their growth. Minimal impediments in their growth, meaning facilitating their move towards acquiring competition so that they can become a monopoly. So while the big businesses were able to influence the government through the PAC, in the year 2010, the Supreme Court essentially opened the floodgates towards campaign finance. In a 5-4 ruling, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations, and by extension unions and other groups, could make unlimited expenditures on messages encouraging votes for or against specific candidates, as long as they had not coordinated directly with the candidates or political parties. And this gave birth to the super PAC. Political campaign spending suddenly reached an explosive level, and the super PACs did not need to disclose their donors. And this essentially started to be termed as dark money. So with the floodgates open and several tech giants emerging in Silicon Valley, the groundwork was laid for a new era in oligarchy. A 2014 study on influence of various groups in a democracy revealed that the average citizen only had 5% influence, whereas the wealthy top 10% exerted a 78% influence on the decisions of US Congress. So the question to be asked is not if the US is an oligarchy, but where on the scale of oligarchy does the US lie? Is it a civilian oligarchy or a sultanistic oligarchy? In a civil oligarchy, you have an elected head of government, but the decisions are heavily influenced by a group of oligarchs with respect to taxation, regulation, and growth and acquisition opportunities. Essentially, the oligarchs are looking at protecting and expanding their wealth. Many democratic countries now fall into this category. In the middle is an authoritarian oligarchy, which comprises the rule of an authoritarian, but heavily supplemented with a group of oligarchs who support the authoritarian financially and politically, because there can be dire consequences to them if they don't. Typically, Russia and China fall in this category. And at the other extreme end is the sultanistic oligarchy, wherein an oligarch himself is the head of government, and the other oligarchs are paying tribute to him to avoid the risk of losing their wealth. On paper, the United States looks like a civil oligarchy right now. But if you look closely at the power and influence of Elon Musk, another oligarch, then you begin to wonder if we are slowly stepping into a sultanistic oligarchy. There's another major factor that has to be considered when we compare this group of oligarchs with those that existed during the Gilded era. The current group of oligarchs belong to the tech industry and as a result exercise control on access to information to the average citizen, which means it is less about the money and more about the business itself and the regulation around it that can start impacting political outcomes. A great example is Meta recently dropping fact-checking on its social media site after pressure from the new Sultan. And on that note, we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. In 1960, radar from Greenland perceived moonlight as inbound Soviet missiles, but American leaders suspected a false alarm. When the alarm went off, American leadership asked the question, "Where is Khrushchev?" And the answer they received was right here in the US. So they determined it was unlikely that the Soviets would target a missile at the United States when their premier was in the United States. So the answer is C. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was visiting the US at that time. Question for the current episode. As restrictions around campaign contributions started getting lax, both political parties stretched them to their limits. And one president awarded big donors with overnight stays in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House during his re-election bid. Who was this president? Was it A. Ronald Reagan, B. Richard Nixon, C. George W. Bush, or D. Bill Clinton? Once again, as restrictions around campaign contributions started getting lax, both political parties stretched them to their limits. And one president in particular awarded big donors with overnight stays in the Lincoln bedroom in the White House during his re-election bid. Who was this president? A. Ronald Reagan, B. Richard Nixon, C. George W. Bush, or D. Bill Clinton? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We'll meet again in 2 weeks with another exciting episode on world history. Till then, stay safe and keep exploring the why in history.